Hi, good day, everybody. So, this is going to be our first discussion for our final term. So, since last time we already introduced this unit, okay, to each and every one of you. So, again, this is going to be about defining, analyzing, and evaluating popular culture using theories and approaches. So, last time we only discussed about popular culture. We introduced what popular culture is, what is its difference from elite culture as well as the mass culture. And we also differentiated different forms or different examples of popular culture. And we tried to connect it to Philippine popular culture. So we used examples of popular culture here in the Philippines. Now we are now going to discuss about the theories and approaches that we are going to use in analyzing these popular culture. Okay, so these forms of popular culture. So again, this discussion is going to be kind of heavy or some sort of difficult if you are not yet familiar with the theories and approaches. But I hope that you have already discussed this during your senior high school. Okay, so during your grade 12. So probably you have already discussed this during your 21st century literature or EAPP subjects or um, reading and writing subjects. So, yun nga, we are just going to parang recap some of those and reinforce some of those. Okay, so now let's begin our presentation. So we are now going to differentiate what is a theory versus what is an approach. Okay, so if you have already read your module, and I also encourage everybody to read the module for this time. Okay, so again, because the PowerPoint presentation is only a summary of what is written or what is discussed in your module. Okay, so in your module there are lots of sources there that you could use. Okay, and you could understand well using the module because again this is only a summary. Okay, so going back to our discussion, what is the difference between a theory and approach? Sometimes people use this interchangeably, but actually they are two different things. Okay, so now let's start with a theory. Okay, so theory actually is the more specific part of the two. Okay, so approach is like the bigger umbrella, or the approach is the more general. Okay, and theory is the more specific part. Okay, so to define, we define theory as composed of combined ideas, concepts, and themes that generally make sense to the behavior, attitude, nature, essence, relationship, and challenges of a certain subject. So again, to emphasize, you use theory to make sense of things, okay, to define or to justify why things act this way, or why is the result like this, or why is this thing like this. Okay, so it's the job of the theory to actually back up as to why it's like that. Okay, so it's trying to make sense of what's happening even in your research, right, in your theoretical framework, right? Kapag nagre-research kayo, your research teachers always ask you, what theory are you going to use to make sense of your results? Okay? So, kasi hindi naman pwede na mag-imbento lang kayo ng kung paano niyo i-analyze yung results, or mag-imbento lang kayo ng explanation dun sa nakuha niyong results. It should be backed up by a theory because again, the theory makes sense of what is happening. Okay? So, next, theory is used to explain a phenomenon by postulating relationships between variables. So again, pag sinabi natin postulating, it tries to parang um, make a list of reasons as to why this is happening. So there is a relationship between two variables or two or more variables, and then you are trying to list reasons kung ano yung relationship nila with one another. Again, so that is the job of theory. So next, employed to scrutinize meanings, nature, relationships, and problems in certain contexts. Okay? So again, it is employed to scrutinize. So when we say scrutinizing, this is an in-depth analysis. You are trying to break down components, and then you are trying to actually look at it detail by detail. Okay? So next or lastly, we have theory may act as guidelines to answer questions that are posed in the study. Okay? So if there are some studies that you want to or if there's some questions that you want to answer, the theory can provide answers to to those questions, or not really answers but as guidelines or on how you are going to answer those questions. So yun yung job ng theory. Again, it is more specific and it tends to explain, okay, the results, and it tries to make sense of the situations or phenomenons. Now, what about approach? Okay, so approach is a view on how you are going to look at something. Okay, so it's a general term on how are you going to what perspective are you going to use, okay, or how are you going to look into the problem or the topic that you want to analyze. Okay, so it's like, how are you going to view things, how are you going to handle things. You are not yet going to make sense of that something. It's just that it's your view on how you are going to handle it. Okay? So, hindi pa kayo nagtatry na sagutin yung mga tanong kasi theory yun. Pag approach, it's just paano nyo siya i-handle, in what perspective are you going to look at it. Okay? So, next, it's the central philosophy about a particular subject matter being presented. So, again, talking about philosophy. What kind of philosophy, what kind of attack are you going to use? Okay, next, it is the way of working in general that is thought about in the onset of study or analysis. Meaning, onset, this is the beginning. Okay, so before you work on your analysis, you must first know what kind of approach are you going to use, okay, in your study or in your analysis. So before you even begin, the first step would be determining what approach are you going to use, because again, this is the way of handling things. How are you going to handle your topic, or how are you going to do your analysis? What perspective are you going to use? Okay, so before you actually do any actions, you have to determine how are you going to look at the actions, okay? So, hindi naman pwede na may actions agad nang hindi mo pinag-iisipan kung saan nanggagaling yung mga actions na yun. So, the approach should always come first, okay? So, again, it's a way of working in general on how are you going to handle your study or your analysis. And then, lastly, it acts as the basis of the theory, methods, and procedures that will be used in the study or analysis, okay? So, again, your approach would be the basis of your theory. So, ibig sabihin, approach muna. So, yung mga inline dun sa approach na yun, dun ka kukuha ng theory. Okay? So, if we are going to compare it to research, kung halimbawa para siyang research, so halimbawa ang study mo ay phenomenological, ang iyong study, parang yun yung approach. Okay? Kasi yun yung way ng pag-handle mo ng research mo. Ngayon, hindi naman pwede na kumuha ka ng theory na hindi inline dun sa phenomenological study, di ba? O kaya halimbawa, sabihin natin ang study mo ay experimental. Okay, experimental yung study mo. So, this is quantitative, right? So, yun yung approach mo. So, you are going to do an experiment. So, yun yung approach mo. So, you are going to handle your data through an experiment. Now, of course, naturally, you cannot use a theory that would not require an experiment, because in the first place, you need an experiment. That's why the theory must always be in line with the way you handle your study or your analysis. So, the same way with approach and theory, okay? So, kapag yung approach mo ay ganito, syempre, dapat kumuha ka ng theory na inline doon. So, mamaya may example tayo doon. So, basically, those are the definitions of the two. So, that's how we differentiate theory versus an approach. Okay? So, let's have an example. Okay? So, paano natin siya gagawin? So, gawin natin siya ng example. Meron kang halimbawa, crush mo. So, yung crush mo, siya yung ating subject. So, subject natin siya or topic natin siya. Siya yung ating i-analyze, pag-iisipan. Okay? So, you have your subject or your topic, your crush. Okay? So, you can have either two approaches that you could do. You could do straightforward approach, meaning walang pabebe, walang palabok, talagang straightforward mong i-approach yung crush mo. Ibig sabihin, talagang pag nakita mo yung crush mo, lalapitan mo siya, diretsahan mo, sasabihin sa kanya na crush mo siya. Okay? So, you have straightforward approach, or you have also, syempre, we have the subtle approach. Pag subtle approach, syempre, medyo pabebe. So, what kind of approach? So, syempre, paano natin i-handle yung feelings natin towards our crush? Okay, so are we going to do a straightforward approach or are we going to do a subtle approach? Yung medyo torpe, medyo nahihiyang approach. So, ano ba yon? Yung makapal na mukhang approach ba or yung medyo nahihiyang approach? Okay, so what kind of approach are we going to do when we approach our crush, which is the subject? Okay, so next. So, kapag ka naman ang ginawa natin ay straightforward approach, yan, pwede natin siya bigyan ng gifts. So, ibig sabihin, tayo mismo, bibigyan natin siya ng gifts. Or, haharanahin natin siya. Or, gagawa natin siya ng banner like after class, ganyan. Or may program, after ng program, lalagyan natin siya ng banner. So, crush kita, ganon. So, tas lalagyan mo pangalan mo. So, ibig sabihin nun, di ba, straightforward. So, yun yung approach natin. Okay? So, dahil straightforward yung approach natin, naisip natin na ito yung mga gagawin ko. Dahil nga, ang approach ko ay straightforward. Ngayon, paano naman kung hindi tayo straightforward na klase ng tao? Paano kung mahiyain tayo? So, yung approach natin is subtle lang. Okay? Now, what are the plans or what are the actions that is in line with the subtle approach? So, pwede na gumamit tayo ng wingmen, yung mga kaibigan natin. So, halimbawa, parang yun yung mga tulay. Okay? So, dahil hindi natin ma-approach yung crush natin, yung mga wingmen or yung mga kaibigan natin, sila yung lalapit dun sa crush natin. So, yon, gagamit tayo ng wingman. What else? Letter sa locker. So, lagyan natin, isisilid natin doon sa locker, ganyan. Or ipapabigay natin sa mga klase nila, ganyan. Or yung secret admirer kind of thing. Okay? So, susulatan natin siya, tapos may secret admirer lagi, or bibigyan natin siya ng gifts, tapos may nakalagay lang from your secret admirer because we cannot do it straightforwardly. Okay? So, we can only do it in a subtle way. Okay? So, these are the actions naman na pwede nating gawin in line dun sa ating approach, which is subtle, kung mahihain tayo. Okay? So, in the same way, yung kanina, yung straightforward and subtle, yun ang mga approaches natin on how we are going to handle our crush or our feelings towards our crush. Okay? Now, what about yung mga actions na ginagawa natin based on dun sa approach natin? So, katulad kanina, kung straightforward, harana, gifts, okay, gagawa nyo siya ng banner. So, those are actually theory, framework, or yung objective standards na meron tayo. Okay? So, katulad nga nun, ayun. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, yung mga actions na gagawin natin, okay, to progress towards our subject must be in line or must be anchored with the kind of approach that we are going to use. Okay? So, halimbawa, hindi pwede na, halimbawa, subtle yung approach mo, subtle kang klase ng tao, mahihain ka. So, subtle yung approach mo, tapos yung action na gagawin mo ay haharanahin mo siya in person. Okay? O kaya gagawin mo siya ng banner. Tatapat ka sa room niya, tapos may banner ka, tapos may mahal kita, ganyan. So, kung subtle yung approach mo, hindi angkop or hindi inline yung gagawin mo na action. So, most likely, it would fail. Okay? So, the same way sa atin, our theory must also be anchored with our approach. Okay? For it to be successful or for the chances of it being successful becomes slightly higher. Okay? So, ayun po. So, wag po tayo malilito. So, again, pag sinabi nating approach, kailangan we set the approach first before we determine what theory we are going to use. Okay? So, ayan, nandito rin to dun sa inyong module. Kinuha ko lang siya, screenshot ko siya. So, basically, this is kind of the same dun sa presentation natin kanina. Okay? So, ayun, just to emphasize dito, so again, for theory, it helps to describe a certain concept or situation, backs up claims, and acts as a framework to make sense of the analysis. Again, it tries to make sense of the analysis. And lastly, it depends on the approach used in the study or analysis. Again, it must be anchored on the approach. So what about the approach? Approach deals with how a study will be treated. Okay, so again, how are you going to handle things? Okay, what is your approach towards your subject? Katulad nga na example natin kanina dun sa crush. Okay, so second, tells the initial course of the whole study or analysis. Okay, so initial course. Ibig sabihin, again, it must be decided or determined on the onset of your analysis or study. And lastly, it does not make sense of the analysis unless backed up by a theory. Say, for example, again, pumili ka ng isang approach. So, hindi naman, liba, yun nga, experimental ang iyong approach in your study or experimental yung naisip mong gawin. Ngayon, hindi naman pwede na, sige, mag-experiment ka, pero paano mo i-interpret yung results nun? Siyempre, kailangan mo ng theory because again, it does not make sense of the analysis unless backed up by a theory because it's the job of the theory to make sense of things that happens, okay? So, yung approach is anong gagawin? Okay? So, anong gagawin natin? Yun yung tanong na sinasagot ni approach. Tapos, si theory naman, ang sinasagot niyang tanong is, paano maiintindihan ang gagawin? Kasi it's trying to make sense nga. Again. Okay, so, approach, anong gagawin natin dito? So, meron na tayong, halimbawa, meron na tayong topic. So, we are going to analyze television series, halimbawa. So, anong gagawin natin sa television series? So, approach. Anong approach yung gagamitin? Okay? Ngayon, meron na kayong approach. So, okay na. Tapos may ina-analyze na kayo. Ngayon, paano nyo itong maintindihan? So, yun yung theory. Okay? So, tayo malilito. So, yan. To give an example on how theory and approach work. Okay? So, again, we have the approach as the bigger idea. Okay? Or the bigger umbrella. So, we have gender-related approach. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, the way you handle things or the way you look at things would be all about gender. So, the thing that you are going to look into in analyzing the text would be all about gender. Okay? So, that is your approach. So, that is gender-related approach. So, you are going to look into gender. How is gender being described or how is gender being treated in the subject? Okay? Or the topic. So, halimbawa, Philippine TV series, ngayon titignan nyo. So, how is gender being presented? Okay, so that would be gender-related approach. Now, we have different kinds of gender-related approach. Okay, so it doesn't really just look into one, actually, into one perspective. So, we have a lot of genders out there. So, there are different theories there. So, the most prominent ones, syempre, we have the feminist theory. So, yun nga, mamaya di-discuss natin. Pero, as you all know, siguro probably it was discussed to you before. So, feminist theory is about, of course, women. Okay? The treatment of women in certain situations. Okay? So, we have also queer. So, for queer, it doesn't really just focus on gays. Okay? So, within the umbrella of queer theory, syempre, kasama na yan dyan. And also, we have the masculinist theory. So, these theories are all part of gender-related approach. Okay? So, that's how it works. Okay? So, ayun po. Now, what about a psychological approach? So, you are using psychology as an approach to analyze. So, when you are looking at like your subject, you are trying to look into the psychology or how does the mind of people work in a certain situation or certain work. So, say for example, TV series na naman. So, how do they present, halimbawa, parang yung mental capacity o yung behavior or yung mga mental illnesses, how do they present it? Okay? So, when you use this, so naturally, you are going to look into the psychology of the characters or basta how psychology is presented, okay, in the work. So, that is your psychological approach. Now, we have different theories, again, for psychological approach. There are lots of theories using psychological approach. Okay? So, you have psychoanalytic theory. Syempre, Freudian psychology, one of the most famous. Okay? So, you have psychoanalytic theory or psychosexual theory. So, you have also personality theory. So, another is you have psychosocial development theory. So, madami yan. Especially, sa education, ang dami-daming mga psychology. You have also behaviorism and all. So, you have a lot of theories related to psychological approach. So, basically, ganun yon. So, may approach muna, tapos ano yung mga theories na related dun sa approach na yon. So, yun nga, kung anong gusto mong gawin na approach, syempre, may mga kaakibat diyon or may mga theories na related dun. Okay? So, yun yung, that's the way on how we analyze things. Okay? Hindi pwede na diretso tayo ng theory agad. Saang approach siya na bibilang, okay? Kasi, syempre, approach is how we handle, okay, our study or our research. Okay, so we are now going to discuss theories and approaches of popular culture or pop culture. So we have selected just a few because there are tons and there are myriads of theories and approaches that we can use in analyzing literature and popular culture. Okay, so but we only chose like a few of them or several of them, the most prominent ones or the most famous ones, because syempre we are not going to analyze full blown kasi nga dahil ang cycle 1 ay sobrang ikli lang, so we're just going to introduce some of the most prominent theories and approaches of popular culture. So number 1, we have cultural approach. Okay, so cultural approach, syempre you are talking about culture. Okay, so the theory related to that is culturalism. Next is sociological approach. Okay, so dealing with society. So you are looking into society. So next, the related theory to that is Marxism, but also we all know there are lots of sociological theories that we could relate to, but we aren't just using Marxism in this discussion. Okay, next, psychological approach. So as mentioned earlier, so we are just going to focus on psychoanalytic theory. Gender and sexuality approach, we are just going to tackle feminism and queer theory. We're not going to touch everything. So structuralist approach, structuralism as the theory, and postmodern approach, so which would include two theories, which is postmodernism and deconstruction. So these are the theories and approaches that we are going to discuss. Okay. So ayan po. So the first one will be cultural approach. So this is just going to be like a very brief discussion. So let's try our best to describe cultural approach because usually, guys, when I discuss this in class, inaabot siya ng 2 to 3 weeks para maintindihan talaga ng mga students kasi nga medyo mabigat siya, especially if this is not your strength. Okay? Pag ito ay weakness ninyo, parang ang hirap niyang ma-absorb unless you are parang English majors or literature majors or Filipino majors, yan medyo madali nila maintindihan. Pero pag yun nga, hindi align din yung course doon, medyo mahirap maintindihan yung mga approaches na to. Okay? So, let's try our best to understand. Okay? Kahit na sobrang bilis na ng discussion. But anyway, if you have any questions, again, you can approach me. Okay? Cultural approach, going back, is a way of looking into a subject using culture as lens. Okay? So, you are trying to look into culture. Okay? So, when you are going to analyze, you are going to use culture as your lens. So, all products, textual, and documented practices of the culture is a reflection of the culture itself, as well as culture has the power to influence and restore. So, meaning, cultural approach is concerned with saying that all products of the culture like literature, songs, TV series, basta lahat ng naging produkto ng kultura na yon is a reflection of the culture itself. So, if we analyze those things or if we analyze the products of the culture, we can analyze the culture din. Okay? So, halimbawa, nakikita or nasasalamin sa mga naipoproduce na mga palabas kung ano tayo bilang mga Pilipino. Okay? So, parang ganun siya in a sense. Okay? Syempre, hindi naman lalabas sa TV yun or hindi naman maipoproduce yung mga yon kung hindi dahil din sa imahinasyon at sa kultura na meron tayo sa Pilipinas. So, nasasalamin sa mga naipoproduce natin na popular culture kung ano tayo bilang mga Pilipino or ano yung kultura natin bilang mga Pilipino. So, yun yung sinasabi ng cultural approach na through analyzing or through looking into culture, we can reveal the truth about our culture. Okay? So, lastly, through culture, an individual may critique a particular subject, work, or concept. So, we can also use culture to critique works of popular culture. Okay? So, halimbawa, tayo ba ay nare-represent ng mabuti nitong work na to or nami-misrepresent tayo? Okay? So, halimbawa, may napanood tayong TV, tapos parang pinapakita nila yung mga parang sinasabi nila na ang mga Pilipino ay ganto, pero hindi naman talaga tayo ganon. Ibig sabihin, that popular culture misrepresents us because it's not our culture. Hindi tayo ganun sa kultura natin. Kapag ka nagkaroon na tayo ng ganong criticism or na-critique natin yung isang bagay na ganon, ibig sabihin, we are already using cultural approach, okay? Because we are looking into culture, okay? So, now we are going to use culturalism, or we are going to analyze culturalism, okay? So, mainly discusses how culture reflects the works that people may have produced, and these may be the key to interpret the culture itself. So again, yung mga products na paproduce natin may be the key to interpret the culture itself. Okay? So, yun nga, halimbawa, nakita natin na itong mga palabas na to, pare-parehas na ganito yung mga palabas. So, ano yung masasabi nun tungkol sa kultura natin? Okay? So, again, it may be the answer, or through analyzing popular culture or literature that was produced by our culture, we can reveal the truth about ourselves as Filipinos and reveal the truth about our culture. So that is what culturalism is, okay? Next, believes that culture is a documented compilation of man's work, thought, and experience. Therefore, texts and works mirror culture and vice versa. So again, through the works produced by the culture, we can also look into the culture. Okay? So pag inanalyze natin yung mga texts and works na meron tayo ngayon, yun nga, dahil sinasalamin niya yung kultura natin, pwede rin nating ma-analyze yung ating culture, or pwede nating maungkat kung ano yung meron tayo sa kultura natin. Paano tayo mag-isip bilang isang lahi, or paano tayo mag-isip bilang isang kultura. Okay? So that is what culturalism is. So basically, culturalism is just like, no, not really like, but it is parang closely related to historical biographical approach. Pero yung historical biographical approach kasi, it's just looking into text, like what is the milieu or what is the setting of the text, and what is the parang setting when the text was written. Okay? So parang yun nga, yung timeline, yung tinitignan. And syempre, yung biographical naman is, yun nga, yung author, paano siya nakaka-apekto dun sa kanya, o yung author mismo, paano siya nakaka-apekto dun sa sinusulat niya na text. Okay, so yun yung historical biographical. So it's closely related with culturalism. It's just that hindi natin tinitignan yung individual na nagsulat nun. Ang tinitignan natin yung kultura kung saan lumaki yung individual na nagsulat nun or yung nag-produce nun. So, paano naka-apekto yung kultura niya dun sa na-produce niya. Okay, so parang ganun yung culturalism. Okay? Third, insists that culture be analyzed in order to delineate trends within a group to understand their commonality and shared experiences. So again, you are trying to analyze the works in order to understand what is common among the people. So, yun nga yung sinasabi natin. Halimbawa, ina-analyze natin yung mga TV series. Tapos, may mga themes silang magkakaparehas. So, ibig sabihin nun, nasasalamin ba nun yung kultura na meron tayo? Okay? So, lastly, inculcates that popular culture must be analyzed to understand and break down the components of the contemporary interests of the people. Again, so popular culture must be analyzed in order to understand what are the interests of the people in this culture. Okay? So, through analyzing popular culture, we can see kung ano ba yung gustong makita ng mga tao sa popular culture natin, or ano yung interest nila. So, ano yung mga bagay na pinapasikat nila kasi dun sila interesado. So, yun yung concern ng culturalism. So, again, you are trying to analyze the works in order to make sense of your culture. Or you are trying to use culture in order to critique the works. Okay, so that is culturalism. Okay, so examples nun. So in this presentation, actually, I'm going to use films because I really love films, and I think films are very interesting to analyze. So yun nga, films yung gagamitin ko. Not necessarily Filipino films, but I'm just going to include the things that I think would best describe the the theories. Okay? So, yun nga. Feeling ko kasi dito ako magaling sa sa pag-analyze ng films. Okay? So, although pwede ko namang gamitin yung mga TV series, pero mahirap kasi mahaba yun. Ito, if ever you want to watch these, at least maikli lang sila. Okay? Pero yung mga TV series, medyo mahaba. Yung mga literature text, hindi naman tayo literature. So, film na lang kasi part din sila ng popular culture. Okay, so going back, so we have culturalism. So we are going to look into the culture. Okay, so say for example, the Gods Must Be Crazy. Sobrang tagal na ng pelikula na to, pero classic siya. Napaka-iconic niya actually. So you have The Gods Must Be Crazy. So ayun nga, titingnan natin kung paano naapektuhan ng kultura or ano yung masasalamin natin sa kultura nito. So makikita natin the culture of the people here, yung mga taga-Africa. So pinapakita na yung kultura nila is very primitive. So, may ang nangyari kasi dyan, may bumagsak na, may napulot silang bote ng Coke, ayan. So, may napulot silang bote ng Coke. Tapos, hindi nila alam kung ano yon. As in, super primitive ng buhay nila dun sa desert na they don't even know what a Coke bottle is. Hindi nila alam kung ano yan. So, they don't know how to use that. Hindi nila alam kung para saan yan. So, makikita natin doon, if we're going to use culturalism in this movie, we are going to analyze kung ganun ba talaga yung mga tao sa Africa nung panahon na yon. Ganun ba sila ka-primitive na hindi talaga nila alam? Or it's just that American culture is parang degrading African culture so much. Okay? So, ano ba yon? Nagiging OA lang ba? It's just that parang is it an exaggeration on the Americans' part? So parang are they exaggerating the life of the people in Africa? Yung payak na pamumuhay ng Africa, are they just making fun of it? Or sa mga panahon na yun, talagang sa kultura ng Africa, although hindi nila alam yung, or although hindi sila nagkakaroon ng parang mga Coke bottles, pero familiar naman sila. Pero parang ginagawa ng American culture is they are trying to distort the culture of Africa, making them look like parang medyo mga bobo dahil hindi nila alam yung hindi nila alam yung Coke bottle. Okay, so that's how we are going to analyze using culturalism. So what could this film reveal about the culture of both the African people and the American people? Okay, so yon. Next is Pocahontas. I think marami sa inyong familiar dito sa film na to or at least nakapanood ng Pocahontas na Disney. Actually, yung Pocahontas, if you would think about it, it's a good film, I guess. Kasi nga, parang sobrang emotional ng mga kanta. Tapos yung, lalo na yung Colors of the Wind, napaka makabuluhan nung kanta, nung lyrics nun. So, maganda siya. Okay? Pero, kung isipin natin, is it really culturally accurate? So, does the film represent culture accurately? So, does the film show culture na does it promote the original culture of Native Americans? Ganyan. So, yung damit ba ay accurate? Yung ayos ba nila ay accurate? Yung mismong story ba ay accurate to the culture? Now, we are now using culture to critique naman. Okay? To critique the work. Okay? So, yun. So, makikita natin na that's how you analyze using culturalism. So, again, you are looking into culture in order to critique the work or you are analyzing the work in order to critique the culture. Okay? So, vice versa. Okay? So, wag sinabing culturalism, parang ganun siya. Okay? So, these are the guide questions that we can use, okay, while we are analyzing using culturalism as a theory. So, what are the influences of particular culture and the representation of popular culture? So, what are the influences of a certain culture, okay, in your subject na ina-analyze in the popular culture? Next, what kind of culture does popular culture represent? Okay? Are issues on ethnicity, religion, and tradition apparent in the representation of popular culture? How does popular culture reflect the changes in culture? how does popular culture represent both the dominant culture and the dominated culture? Okay, so this applies when a certain culture has like a dominant culture and a dominated culture. Example, here in the Philippines, we have the dominant culture, which is, of course, mainstream Filipinos, okay? Mga nasa urban areas or urbanized areas or rural areas, pero yun nga, may parang, alam nyo natin yun, may mga municipalities and all, versus the dominated culture, which is yung ating mga indigenous people, okay, mga katutubo. Okay? And what does popular culture reveal about the common interests of the people within a particular culture? Okay? So, ano yung, dahil in-analyze natin, we analyze the popular culture. Now, what does this reveal about our interests, okay, as a particular culture? Okay? So, yun yung sinasabi natin na culturalism. Halimbawa, i-analyze natin yung TV series, tapos halos lahat ng mga palabas may kabet. So, ibig sabihin ba nun, yung mga Pilipino mahilig sa kabet? So, yan. Ganun yung mga example natin ng culturalism. Now, we have sociological approach. Okay? So, as an approach, ano ba itong sociological approach na tinatawag natin? So, the approach basically states that a society has a huge impact on shaping culture and literature, thus emphasizing its inseparability from culture and literature. So, ibig sabihin, you cannot really separate, tawag nito, society and literature, because literature, of course, everything that it shows or everything that it contains is what it's anchored on the society, or kung ano mo yung pagkakatatag ng society. So parang ganun din siya. So next, this approach aims to highlight the societal, economic, and political relationships in representations. So when you are going to use sociological approach, the things that you are going to look into would be, of course, societal. So how does society affect the text or the subject? Economy and politics. Okay, so how does the text or the subject or popular culture represent society, economy, and politics? Okay, so yun yung titignan nyo pagka ginamit nyo itong sociological approach. Again, societal, economic, and political representations. So, focusing on Marxism. So, we all know naman yung Marxism, same old, parang juxtaposition of the rich and the poor, the dominated versus the dominant, the elites versus the masses. So, same old ganun pag sinabi natin Marxism. But just to define, so it talks about the imbalance prevailing in the society and banks on the existing disparity between the social classes. Okay, so again, you are talking about the imbalance of power in the society. So prevalent in the society or between the social classes. Okay, so there is always a gap. According to Marxism, there is always a gap between the social classes. The social classes are never equal. Okay? There's always imbalance. Okay? Existing according to Marxism. So, hindi kailanman nagpapantay yung mahirap at mayayaman. Talagang lagi nakaangat yung isang bahagi ng lipunan natin. And there's always a gap between them. Okay? So, dahil nga may nakakaangat, so laging meron silang kumbaga stepping stone between. So, halimbawa, ito yung mahirap. So, bago pa sila maging mayaman, marami silang pagdadaanan ng mga steps. Okay? So, parang gano'n yung sinasabi ng Marxism. There's always an imbalance of power. So, next, demands that texts and practices must be analyzed in relation to their historical conditions of production or to look into the changing situation of consumption and reception. So, related pa rin to dun sa discussion natin about the imbalance of power. So, you have conditions of production. So, halimbawa, yung mga mahihirap, sila yung todo kayod, todo trabaho, so nagkakasakit na sila kakatrabaho para mag-produce ng mga bagay na hindi naman sila yung makakakuha or hindi naman sila yung makakatanggap. Na yung mga nakakakuha nun, yung mga taong nasa taas na hindi naman masyadong nagtatrabaho. Okay, na kasing bigat na gaya nila. Halimbawa, yung mga magsasaka, di ba sila yung talaga nag-i-invest ng time, ng pagod, sila yung talagang tubo ng mga palay, pero sila yung walang makain. Sino yung kumakain? Yung mga mayayaman na konting trabaho lang ginagawa, pero sila naman yung nakakabili dahil sila yung may pera. Okay? So, yun yung tinatawag natin doon na isa sa mga problems ng Marxism. Okay? There is an imbalance and of course, there is a changing situation of consumption and reception. And lastly, in Marxist context, the base represents the working class wherein they are considered as the spine of the society. So, yun nga, we have what we call as the base. Okay? So, sa pyramid, sila yung base. Sila yung nasa pinakailalim. That's why they are the base. Okay? And then, they are the foundation. Kasi nga, sila yung pinakamalapad. Okay? Yung working class or yung mga mahihirap, yung mga nagtatrabaho, na blue-collar jobs, sila yung nasa pinakababa, sila yung pinakamalapad kasi mararami yung mga mahihirap, tama? So, yun, sila yung nasa baba, they are the base, they are the foundation of the society, they are the spine because they do the work. Okay, they do the work most of the time. Okay, so and then we have what we call as the ruling class, yung mga nasa taas ng pyramid. Makikita natin, konti lang yung mga nasa taas, konti lang yung mayayaman. Okay, sila-sila lang din yung nandun. Okay, so makikita natin na nasa pinakailalim, pinakamalapad yung working class, they are the spine, but hindi sila yung nasa taas. Ang nasa taas ay yung mga mayayaman. Okay, so you have the pyramid. Yun yung tinatawag nila na tatsulok. Okay. So, okay, so it contrasts the way of living of the people coming from the, coming from the lower society to that of the people coming from the upper society. So again, basic Marxism, you are going to compare the rich people versus the poor people, the upper society versus the lower society, the privileged versus the underprivileged, okay? So, yun yung same old Marxism. Very basic Marxism yun. Although there are lots of kinds of Marxism, to be specific, pero yun nga, we are just going to do the basic Marxism, which is, of course, juxtaposing the privileged versus the underprivileged categories. So next, reveals the power struggles in the society and shows how these operate and what are its consequences. So ito yung mga tinitignan natin kapag Marxism. Again, you are trying to reveal the power struggles in the society, paano yun nangyayari, and what are the consequences of that imbalance of power. Okay? Next, believes that the middle class or the bourgeoisie exploits the working class or the proletariat. Okay? So, we have the middle class. Ito yung parang mga may kaya. Hindi naman sila yung super mayaman. Hindi naman sila yon. Pero sila yung mga may kaya, may pera. Pero, how do they exploit the working class or what we call as the proletariat? Okay? So, paano nila inaapi yung mga mahihirap or paano nila ini-exploit. Halimbawa, pinag-overtime nila pero thank you lang, ganyan, walang compensation, mga ganyan. Okay? So, juxtaposes the rich and the poor, the majority and the minority, or the people and the ruling body. So, yun nga, as mentioned earlier. And views that through the analysis of popular culture, we can be aware of the existing gap between the social classes and somehow be an agent of change. So, this inculcates the importance of Marxism. So why are we using Marxism as means of analyzing popular culture? It's because through the analysis of popular culture, again, we can be aware of the existing gap. So, pag pinanood natin yung mga palabas or kapag nakita natin yung mga popular culture, napakinggan natin yung mga music, tapos ginamitan natin ng Marxism, we would eventually realize that there is really an imbalance of power in the society, that there is really a gap between the social classes. So, knowing that there is an existing gap between the social classes and there is parang an injustice or impartiality, so, syempre, we can do something about it and somehow be an agent of change. Okay? So, ayan, halimbawa ng mga movies na nagtatampok ng Marxism or kung pwede natin gamitin ang Marxism would be, of course, Les Miserables. So, kung napanood nyo to, maganda tong film na to. So, you have Les Miserables. Siyempre, makikita nyo dyan, although there is an individual story, like about Jean Valjean, sa kanya as an individual, but the whole film shows struggle between the classes, the injustices committed to the lower society. Okay? So, makikita nyo yung dyan, yung yung struggle ng social classes sa Les Miserables. What else? Yung Hunger Games. Siguro naisip nyo yung Hunger Games, nung pinanood nyo siya, parang simpleng nanonood lang kayo or nag-enjoy kayo dun sa film. But actually, if you are going to analyze Hunger Games, di ba, you can see that the Capitol, ang sarap ng buhay nila. So, pinapanood lang nila sa TV. Parang entertainment lang yung Hunger Games, which is a real-time game, a reality show na may mga bata talagang namamatay, may mga teens na namamatay talaga doon, and they are just looking at it like it's some sort of parang a show that they enjoy. So you can see there that the capital is the privileged one. They don't really struggle with food, they have electricity, they have parang very extravagant lives, 'di ba? They don't fight for their life, they don't fight for their food compared to the participants of the Hunger Games na sila ay kailangan nilang lumaban, kailangan nilang mamatay para may makain yung district nila. So kita natin the capital, which is the ruling body, exploits the lower classes, the working classes, okay? Which is, yun nga, yung mga districts. Kasi yung capital, wala naman sila masyadong ginagawa. Pero yung mga district yung kumakayod to provide what? To provide resources for them. Kasi makikita natin, di ba, each district doon, meron silang bawa, may wood, may coal, ganyan, may mga food. Yung mga district, yung mga kumakayod para may maibigay sila sa capital. Yung capital, wala masyadong trabaho. Okay, so you can see there, di ba, meron pa din yung base versus the superstructure. Okay? So you can use Marxism to analyze, actually, to analyze Hunger Games. So, ayun. And in the Philippines, yun nga, itong indie film na to, napakaraming awards. Ang ganda nito, Pamilya Ordinaryo. So, pwede nyo siyang panoorin. Ang ganda ng pelikula na yun, Pamilya Ordinaryo, kasi about dun sa isang, mahirap sila. So, judging from their parang, yun nga, mga damit, clothing, ganyan, itsura. So, they are parang part of the lower classes. Sila ay mga squatter, wala silang, informal settler sila, wala silang tirahan talaga, pag-alagala lang sila. Tapos sila ay mga batang magulang, they are just teens, tapos nabuntis nga yung babae, so nanganak siya. So, syempre, they don't really have the resources to be parents of the child. So, yun nga yung struggle. So, makikita natin, struggle na naman. Kasi, yung ibang mga privileged, hindi naman sila namang problema, actually, kung paano bubuhayin yung bata. May naman problema sila, pero konti lang. Pero ito talaga, hindi nila alam kung anong gagawin, okay? So, you can see there that there are struggles na certain social classes only experience, whereas other social classes do not experience at all, okay? So, you have here examples of films which we can use for Marxism. So, ayan, another is Buy Bust. Okay? Yung mga local films naman na pwede natin gamitin yung Marxism. Okay, so what are the guide questions that we can use in order to analyze popular culture using Marxism? Okay, so halimbawa, nanood kayo ulit ng Hunger Games or nanood kayo ng Les Miserables, so you can ask these questions to yourself while you are watching. Okay, so in order to analyze using Marxism. Okay, so how does popular culture portray the social classes? What constitutes the majority and the minority? How about the rich and the poor? Okay. Are there any signs of oppression, neglect, or abuse between the classes? So, parang yung mga ruling classes ba, do they oppress, do they neglect, or do they abuse the other classes? Are there any signs of social mobility? When say social mobility, parang a person is able to parang makaangat sa lipunan, or parang medyo, or yung mayaman, bumaba naman yung ano niya, yung pwesto niya. Okay, so yun tatawag natin social mobility. Yung hindi lang sila stagnant. So they can jump from one social class to another. Okay, so if there is, how is its representation? So is it well represented, yung social mobility? Are there representations of popular culture directed to the ruling class, the working class, or both? Okay? What are the social forces that affect popular culture? So these are the questions that you can use when you decide to use Marxism as a theory if you're going to analyze popular culture. Okay, so another, whom does it benefit if the work or effort, Ayun, whom does it benefit if the work or effort is accepted, successful, believed, etc. So, itong question na to, sino yung makikinabang kapag ka naging successful yung popular culture na yun? Halimbawa, popular culture na yan. Say, for example, film. Sumikat yung film na yon, naging blockbuster siya. Ngayon, sino yung magbe-benefit dun sa work na yon kapag ka sumikat siya or pinaniwalaan siya? Okay, yung lower class ba? Middle class ba? O yung high classes, elite classes? Sino yung makikinabang? Okay, so halimbawa, sumikat yung Hunger Games, sino yung nakikinabang doon? Or sumikat yung Les Miserables, sino yung makikinabang doon? Okay, so you have Marxism. What is the social class of the author? Of course, yun, nakaka-affect din naman yun. Kasi the way he or she represents the work may be related to the social class. Pero ito, I would not really recommend so much of this because this is parang some sort of historical biographical. Okay, which class does the work claim to represent? Okay? So, sino yung nire-represent niya? Sino yung protagonist? Yung anong social class nabibilang yung protagonist? So, ayun, yung antagonist, saan naman siya nabibilang? Okay? So, what value does it reinforce? So, ano yung value, ano yung lesson, ano yung moral na ini-instill nung work na yon? Okay? About the society or the economy or the politics. What values does it subvert? What conflict can be seen between the values the work champions and those it portrays? Okay? So, ano yung conflict? What social classes do the characters represent? Yun nga sabi ko kanina, yung protagonist, anong social class siya nabibilang? Yung antagonist, anong social class siya nabibilang? Okay? So, how do characters from different classes interact or conflict? So, how do they interact with one another? Say, for example, the protagonist comes from parang the lower classes. Tapos, yung isa pang protagonist ay galing naman sa upper classes. Okay, sa elite classes. So, nag-aaway ba sila? Or mabait naman sila sa isa't isa? What can we deduce from that? Okay, so that could be an example of Marxism. Okay, so this will end our first video for this discussion. Okay, so we are going to continue with psychological approach naman. So let me end our discussion, first discussion with this one. So I'm going to see you in the next video.